The first story comes from a college student who took the train every Friday night to return home. His classes ended late, and he usually reached the station around 9:15 p.m., just in time to catch a nearly empty train heading toward the outskirts of the city. He had taken the same train for over a year and never experienced anything unusual. But one rainy Friday night, everything felt different the moment he stepped onto the platform. The station was unusually quiet. The vending machines hummed loudly, echoing through the hall as if the station itself was breathing. The arrival boards flickered, showing only one train available, his usual one. When it pulled in, he noticed the lights were dimmer than normal, and the inside looked darker than usual. Still, he stepped inside and took his seat in the same place he always did, the second coach, last row, window side. As the train began moving, he realized something was off. The usual passengers weren't there. No tired workers, no students, no elderly people heading home, just him completely alone, or so he thought. A few minutes later, he felt a subtle shift, like someone had stepped onto the same coach from the next carriage. He didn't hear footsteps, but he felt that faint pressure in the air when another person enters a space. He looked up, expecting to see someone walking down the aisle, but the entire coach was empty. He tried to reassure himself that maybe the feeling was just in his head, but then he noticed something in the window's reflection, a faint, blurry silhouette standing several rows behind him. His heart started pounding. He turned around instantly, but the seats were empty. No one was there. For the next few minutes, he tried to ignore it. He put on his earphones, but the train's Wi-Fi wasn't working, and his phone kept losing signal. He sat there in uncomfortable silence, staring at the dark window. When he blinked, he saw the faint shape again, closer this time. He turned around, but again saw nothing. The third time he noticed the reflection, the shape was directly behind him, like it was leaning forward to whisper into his ear. This time he didn't turn around. Something inside him told him not to. Instead, he stared at the window, frozen, too afraid to even breathe. The reflection was a distorted image of a person with long, messy hair and hollow, dark eye sockets. The mouth was open unnaturally wide, like it was screaming silently. He finally gathered the courage to turn around, but the moment he did, the lights in his coach flickered violently and then went completely out. In the total darkness, he heard breathing, not his own. Slow, raspy, dragging breaths coming from directly behind him. He felt a cold pressure on the back of his neck, like someone was inches away from touching him. He couldn't move. The breathing grew louder, almost hungry. When the lights finally snapped back on, he saw no one. The coach was empty again. He grabbed his bag, ran to the next carriage, and stayed near the door for the rest of the trip. When the train finally arrived at his stop, he bolted out. Later, when he told the station attendant what happened, the man looked at him strangely. He said that particular coach had been closed off for months because a young woman had passed away inside it after being stuck on the train during a malfunction. Since then, passengers had reported strange figures, breathing sounds, and reflections of people who weren't there. The student never took that train again. The second story belongs to a railway worker who experienced something he could never find a logical explanation for. He worked night shifts, maintaining tracks and switches along an old route that cut through thick forest. Most nights were peaceful, but one night became the most horrifying experience of his life. Around 2 a.m., he received a report that one of the sensors near a remote section of the track had malfunctioned. That area was far from any station, and the only way to reach it quickly was by using a small maintenance cart. He and a colleague set out into the night, the dark trees surrounding them like a tunnel. The night was foggy, and the air felt unnaturally still. They arrived at the spot after a few minutes and immediately sensed something was wrong. The forest around them was dead silent. No insects, no owls, no rustling, nothing. They approached the sensor area and froze. There were footprints on the track, bare footprints, human, and they weren't old, they looked fresh. The prince went along the track for several meters before disappearing abruptly at the edge of the tunnel entrance. His colleague whispered that nobody should be in the area at that time. The nearest town was hours away on foot, and there were signs everywhere warning people to stay away from the tracks. They both followed the prints until they reached the tunnel. The smell inside was damp and metallic, and the darkness felt thicker than normal. His colleague turned on a flashlight, and the beam barely cut through the blackness. They walked a few steps in, calling out if anyone was there. No answer. Then, from deep inside the tunnel, they heard footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps, echoing off the walls. They expected to see a person coming toward them, but instead, the footsteps stopped completely. The worker flashed the light deeper, and for a moment, something appeared at the edge of the beam. A pale figure standing still, a person but unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. The figure didn't move, it didn't blink. It just stood there, facing them, its head slightly tilted. They called out again, but the figure didn't react. The worker stepped forward cautiously, shining the light directly on it. That's when they both realized the figure wasn't standing, it was hovering. Its feet were inches above the ground. Before they could react, the figure suddenly rushed toward them with impossible speed. They didn't even have time to scream. The flashlight flickered violently, and the moment the light stabilized, the figure was gone. They ran out of the tunnel and didn't stop until they reached the maintenance cart. When they reported what happened, their supervisor told them a chilling story. Years ago, a woman from a nearby village had been hit by a train in that same tunnel after wandering onto the tracks. Ever since, several railway workers had reported seeing a pale figure or hearing footsteps inside the tunnel. Some even claimed they felt hands grabbing their shoulders or heard whispers echoing through the darkness. The worker quit his job a few months later and never went near that forest again. The third story comes from a man who used to travel long distances for work, often taking overnight trains. He preferred night journeys because they allowed him to sleep, and he would wake up closer to his destination without losing daytime hours. But one night, during a long journey across the countryside, he learned that sometimes sleep is the last thing you want on a train. He boarded around 11 p.m., placed his bag above his seat, and settled in. The train was moderately full, and everything seemed normal. People were talking quietly, some already asleep, and the coach lights glowed softly. He eventually dozed off. A few hours later, he woke up feeling extremely cold. Not the typical cold from air conditioning, this was deeper, like the kind that sinks into your bones. The train was pitch black. All interior lights were out, and the only light came from the moon shining through the windows. He sat up slowly, trying to adjust his eyes to the dark. That's when he realized none of the passengers were moving. Everyone around him was sitting perfectly upright, staring forward, completely silent. He whispered to the man sitting across from him, but the man didn't react. He tried again, louder, but nothing. It was like they were all frozen. Suddenly, the train slowed down, screeching loudly against the rails as if it were struggling to stop. When it finally came to a halt, the man looked outside and saw they weren't at a station. They were in the middle of an open, empty field. No lights, no houses, nothing but grass stretching endlessly in all directions. He felt a deep dread settle in his chest. Why had the train stopped here? Before he could gather his thoughts, something moved outside, a shadow gliding across the field. It was massive, larger than any person. It stopped right outside his window. As he squinted into the darkness, trying to see what it was, the entire coach filled with a foul smell like rotting flesh. The passengers who were frozen suddenly turned their heads slowly toward the windows, all at the same time, in perfect unison. Their movements were mechanical, unnatural. Their eyes were open wide, glassy, and lifeless. The man tried shaking the person next to him, but they didn't blink or speak. They only stared forward. Then he heard tapping at the window, slow, deliberate tapping. He turned his head toward the sound, and his heart almost stopped. A long, twisted hand with unnaturally thin fingers was pressed against the glass. The fingers scraped down the window, making a sharp, grating noise. The shadow outside leaned forward, trying to see inside. All he could make out was a distorted face with two hollow eyes, dark, deep, and empty, staring straight at him. Suddenly, the train's lights flashed back on, blinding everyone for a second. When the man opened his eyes, everything was normal again. The passengers were asleep. The train was moving. The moonlit field was gone. Panicked, he rushed to find a guard, but no one believed him. They said the train had never stopped and there had been no blackout. He spent the rest of the journey sitting wide awake, staring at the window to make sure nothing was there. Months later, he met another traveler who used the same route. When he mentioned his experience, the traveler grew pale and said several passengers had reported similar nightmares during that stretch of track, dreams of shadows outside, trains halting in places that didn't exist, and passengers who froze like statues. Some believed it was linked to an accident years ago where several passengers had died in their sleep during a nighttime derailment. Whatever he saw that night, he never took an overnight train again. These stories remind us that even the most ordinary places can hide the darkest secrets. A train, a tunnel, a nighttime journey, all normal things until something unexplainable happens. The next time you sit on a train and stare out into the darkness, remember these stories. Somewhere out there, someone else might be living one right now.